Hello, everyone, the audience of East Asia Institute. Today, it's a very great opportunity to have Maria Lessa, the well-known journalist and Nobel Peace Prize winner of 2021. And Maria has fought very actively, not only inside the Philippines, also internationally. So I'd like to ask basically several questions to Maria. Maria, thank you very much for taking time to have a talk with me for the EAI audience.
No, I'm so glad that it worked.
Yeah,
right?
It worked.
Yes, it's good to be here. Thank you for having me.
I'm curious because you had to face 10 times of the arrest warrant during the Duterte government. After you have a new government, a son of the former President Marcos, and Junior we call Bongbong Marcos, right? Is the situation of media freedom is improved under the new government? That's my first question.
Yeah, I think, strange. I've been asked this a lot, and I will say almost immediately yes. And, I point to just January this year, I had 4 tax evasion charges, criminal charges that could have put me in prison for 34 years. And Rappler was also charged a ridiculous criminal tax evasion charges. And after 4 years and 2 months, 3 justices of the Court of Tax Appeals threw it out. We were acquitted, and when you read the verdict, you actually realize, so how did this make it to court? I think the justices are slowly, you're seeing the independent judiciary come up, which means that the checks and balances are slowly kicking back in. So I think that's a first step. In the past, under the last administration, it was a tactic of harassment and intimidation to make journalists voluntarily give up their rights, right? Which is, people would call it the chilling effect. I would call it Siberia. We lived in Siberia during that time period, and there were costs for standing up to power. It's still pretty early, but President Marcos, Bongbong Marcos, the only son and namesake of Ferdinand Marcos, who was accused of stealing $10 billion US dollars in 1986 dollars. Well, he has spent more of his first 100 days traveling outside the Philippines. He cares what the rest of the world thinks. He has, I think what you see is a leader of the country who also is looking to vindicate his family name. And so I hope that he listens and also continues his focus, like his father, is on the economy. This is a difficult time for the world post-COVID. Right. Yes. And the Philippine growth rate is significantly better than the West. But so whether or not this translates into real policies that help our people, that's the challenge ahead.
I'm very glad that the situation of media freedom has been improved. But
we were so low that everything was a slight improvement.
And the friends in Philippines were talking about the possible backlash under the new president, because he may try to legitimize his father's legacy and the authoritarian period of your country.
I think this is happening in almost every country around the world. We are testing history. And with the rise of the far right, with the rise of when lies spread faster than facts on the delivery platform for information, on technology platforms, on social media, it makes every part of history debatable, right? If facts are debatable, then everything, and what we have on social media is 2 algorithms working. The first is on Facebook, Friends of Friends algorithm, which essentially polarized us, right? We saw this happen in the Philippines in 2016 when Duterte was elected. If you were pro-Duterte, you moved further right. If you're anti-Duterte, you move further left. This is what happened in the United States, in Hungary, in Brazil. You see this, but there's a recommendation engine, and you see this in YouTube, you see this in Facebook, where if you click on a video on YouTube, for example, or on Twitter, you would then be fed, the recommendation engine will bring you something more extremist. So there's a downward radicalization. There's a polarization and a radicalization. So your question becomes more complicated in this information ecosystem for Marcos. And now kind of, it's interesting with Korea, with Germany, which has seen the rise of, of the far right. All of these things were embedded in our society, and civil society groups use tactics like name and shame to determine what right is. But right now, when lies are rewarded, the world turns upside down, and this becomes debatable. So in terms of actions himself, what we've seen from President Marcos, again, because the bar was set so low by the previous administration, we now see a little bit of a professional governance, a professional way. He shows up, he doesn't curse, policy is clearer, the appointments are clearer. This administration does listen to the public backlash for bad policy. But I think despite the fact that we've suffered because of the weaponization of the law, I'm also of the same mind that we need to be fair and look at the actions today and not necessarily the past. Although this is the hard part. Was he a tax evader, right? Did he fail to pay his taxes? It's ironic because he now encourages Filipinos to pay their taxes. So, you have, it's a little bit, it's very confusing. Where is the moral high ground? At the same time, this is where I become slightly pragmatic. My task as a journalist in Rappler, our task is to hold power to account. We will give you the context of this, right? With India's Prime Minister Modi, both Modi and Marcos could not travel to the United States. But when they were democratically elected by their people, they could travel. A lot of these things go away, all right? So he was overwhelmingly elected. So I guess part of it is we need to stay vigilant. We need to keep doing the stories. Rappler and I still have 3 criminal cases against us. There's a 5th tax evasion charge. There's a cyber libel case. There is the securities case that is connected to foreign control. Oh, you have to be optimistic. Otherwise, it can be debilitating.
Okay. Well, you mentioned about so much different perspective about the past history.
Yeah.
And it is happening in Korea too, about the colonial period and also the authoritarian period.
Correct.
So it's very, very dividing our civil society, not to mention our politicians, right? And we have so many medias, not only newspapers, all the YouTube and social media. So it's difficult to see whether there is the truth or if the divided society can compromise or come up with a consensus about historical interpretations. So in that kind of environment, what would be the good advice to control this information and also encourage the divided politics to come up with a more constructive common ground?
Yes. So, I feel, so first of all, I always felt Korea was in a better place. Partly, this is when we go back to Milan Kundera's quote, "The struggle of man against power is the struggle of memory against forgetting." And the design of social media today actually turns a lie into a fact, right? A lie told 1,000,000 times becomes a fact. I said this in the Nobel lecture. This has now become an individual battle for integrity, an individual battle for facts, an individual battle for values. Which is why it's great that Korea is not just held this second democracy summit of the regional grouping, but also will be holding the next one. It is good that the third democracy summit is coming to Asia, which, by the way, according to the latest VDEM report, the Asia Pacific has seen the worst decline of the quality of our democracies globally. The rest of the world has gone back to 1986 levels. In Asia Pacific, we're at 1978 levels. So what's the solution? So first, you still have, part of it is because of the culture of Korea. Traditional news organizations still have significant power. They're losing business control. The business model is dying quickly. And I think it's interesting that in Korea, Google is not number one. Naver is. But these news organizations have given up significant power and relationships to Naver. I think the same thing that Korea needs to do the same thing that we've been pushing in the EU, in advocating is the right word, I guess. Part of it is, I'm tired of doing the whack-a-mole game of either content moderation or trying to fight the 90 hate messages per hour. It's impossible. We should not be fighting it downstream. We have to fight upstream. So in the long term, first is education. Medium term is legislation. And in the short term, it is the awareness that we are being insidiously manipulated, that our biology, our emotions are being used against us. And that, on social media, this is an MIT study from 2018, lies spread at least 6 times faster than facts. And if it includes inciting hate, inciting fear, inciting tribalism, this is part of the reason we're so polarized. This is created. It appeals to the worst of human nature, to the worst of society. And the impact is not just at the individual level, it is sociologically at the group level, right? We behave differently in groups. I went back in my book, I talked about the Milgram study, where this is a study that was done, and it was supposed to have been done in Germany. Stanley Milgram did this, and he didn't do it in Germany. He did it in the United States on a campus, and the test was, you were told. So there were test subjects behind a screen, and you were told, the test was told, you have to keep giving longer and longer electric shocks to the people who you see, and then they see the person suffering more and more, who essentially are acting for the subject, and yet with authority they continue to give electric shocks, right? There's something in when we're in groups, when authority tells us, gives us permission to be our worst selves, we do it. And this is where, some of the warnings, for example, of Timothy Snyder in On Tyranny is, don't follow the group. So that's the second level. The third level is human behavior, emergent human behavior, our evolution as a species. This is addictive. Our young generation have higher levels of depression, of sleeplessness. Facebook's one of Meta's own internal reports, that was one of 10,000 plus documents released by the whistleblower Frances Haugen, actually showed that young teenager girls on Instagram have increased levels of eating disorders. Right? The impact, the harms now are very clear. Aside from, killing democracy. Actually, more than that, it's the rise of fascism.
Okay. We haven't debated a lot about this social media world, and also this horrible disinformation effect. But as a journalist, when you face the conflicting principle, namely freedom of expression, and another principle of protecting privacy, do you reconcile when these two principles are colliding?
It is false to say that they collide, because this is not a freedom of speech issue, right? It is actually a gatekeeping issue, which news organizations were the gatekeepers to the public sphere. You could hold us accountable. If we distributed a lie, if we echoed a lie, we could be sued, right? Right now, the tech companies make more money and surveillance for profit. And we didn't even have a name for that business model until 2019, when Shoshana Zuboff wrote Surveillance Capitalism. And surveillance capitalism actually goes into how these tech companies use machine learning to create models of us that know us better than we know ourselves. And this I've lived through, and I see this, right? Those models are then scooped up by AI, and that becomes the motherlode database that is used to micro-target. Micro-targeting is not the old advertising we know. Micro-targeting knows your weakest moment to a message and sells it. And this advertising marketing model, it started that way, is now what is exploited by geopolitical power. That exploitation began in 2014. Like, we saw experiments, right? But in 2014, Russian disinformation began to target Crimea, began to target America, began to target Korea. I mean, these are some of the things, and as they succeeded, and they did succeed, it was replicated in different countries around the world. Part of the reason we are seeing illiberal leaders elected democratically, because if you don't have integrity of facts, you cannot have integrity of elections.
Right. If we extend this debate to North Korea, it's not just the illiberal leader, it's a totally closed society, and people are indoctrinated. What will be the good way for the Democrats to intervene in the psychic of North Koreans about this all these freedom issues and democracy issues? Have you thought about the North Korean case?
I mean, if you look at the world today, right, we have several cases that Russia invaded Ukraine. The world came together, reacted on it, and now the ICC came up with an arrest warrant. That's the quickest the world has acted since World War II, right? Syria, for example, was very disjointed. People thought, oh, well, democracy doesn't really need to get nurtured. It will survive all of these. I called it death by 1,000 cuts, coming from Al-Qaeda's own idea that this is the way you fight for it. You have Taiwan, which is engulfed by information operations by China, right? Taiwan separated from China. And then you have South Korea and North Korea. You have the Koreans. And I think you see them as kind of different stages of it. And what I'm worried about is that if we don't do anything significant with our information ecosystem, we wind up like North Korea. Because think about it like this, right? In January 2021, on January 6th, we saw for the first time violence on Capitol Hill.
In USA, yeah.
This is, when you say North Korea indoctrinates, I say social media is a behavior modification system. And because it is in echo chambers, how far will it go, right? We saw January 6th violence in the United States. We saw January 8th violence this year in Brazil. And, one of the things that's fascinating, and not enough research has been done on this, but the role of YouTube, for example, in Brazil, in the United States, in the Philippines, in Korea, because YouTube, so this is research by the Belfer Institute that was released by the Belfer Institute in Harvard. Essentially, they started working on clustering algorithms of YouTube on Zika before COVID. And then they worked on Bolsonaro. And what they showed was that Bolsonaro was a far-right fringe figure. But essentially, he was brought to the center, became president, because the algorithms of YouTube in recommending content clustered together the far right, the fringe, every single conspiracy theory that in the real world would never have been able to find each other. They were too far fringe, but they had common. It's a terrorist idea. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. This is essentially what you saw happen, and this clustering algorithm of recommendation engine provided the support base. This is this is in a book by Max Fisher. It's called The Chaos Machine. He claims this then brought Bolsonaro to the presidency. And if you look then, is this the same clustering algorithm that created the violence on January 8th? Go back to Yuri Andropov, who's a former KGB chairman, and he talked about disinformation in a way that I don't think we in democratic countries take seriously. And his quote is this, he said, "Disinformatia is like cocaine. You take it once or twice, you're okay. But if you take it all the time, you're a changed person." This is where we are in 2023 after algorithms have exploited us and used our data to change the way we think through our emotions and ultimately the way we act.
Yes, it was fascinating. I'm sure our audience learned a lot from Maria Lessa, who is so experienced in online media and also fighting for democracy. So Maria Lessa, thank you so much for having time to talk about this issue.